we have Dan Murphy here. Give us a wave, Dan.
Hello.
Yeah, because that's all right. We've got enough people, haven't we? So we're not going into a separate screen at the moment. So that's really useful. Lucy Curtis gives us a wave. Hi, Lucy. And Lauren Bracewell, who you've all had a lot of contact with. And so we have met. So Dan, I met you through the open call out, I think quite a number of years ago, and you had a project and you had Carry On Jaywick, and I said let's have it in the foyer, and I think it was one of the first Outer Limits performances in the foyer, and it was kind of an extraordinary evening because at that point I don't think, in terms of the work, really Carry On Jaywick is a kind of independent theatre, and it I suppose we hadn't really developed an audience for kind of risk-taking theatre, but it oh, there you are. It's now working properly. Whatever you did, Janine, it's worked. It sold out. That performance sold out. And the audience responded absolutely brilliantly to it, which was really just a kind of really important moment for me in terms of programming work, that there was an audience who were really engaging with verbatim theatre. That was a really wonderful moment, and what the possibility of some of the work that we could present. Lauren makes work at the theatre, has made a number of projects at the theatre, and is also an administrator of the theatre. Obviously, one of the particular projects is Outer Limits, and which is really brilliant. It sort of came into your portfolio about a year ago, didn't it, Lauren?
Yeah.
And the brilliant thing about having an artist administrate that project is that she's incredibly sensitive and communicates rather brilliantly with you all. So, I'm so thrilled that Lauren is leading on that project. So if you ever have, do never be frightened of contacting Lauren about, work and supporting work, because Lauren's an artist herself, so she knows exactly what you're all going through. And then Lucy, you worked with the Youth Theatre first, didn't you?
Yeah. I think that's how I started.
That's how you came to the Queen's Theatre, and you delivered some projects, and then I asked you to lead on this project that ran alongside Women's Stories of Made in Dagenham. And so all three of you make work that, you do lots of different things. So Dan, you're primarily a playwright. Lauren, you're kind of a director and a deviser, a theatre maker. And Lucy, equally, you're you've just been at the RSC as an assistant director. Is that right?
At the Royal Exchange.
The Royal Exchange. So you've been quite sort of traditionally focused, but also you have a long career in working with communities, and also making work around, using people's words and stories. So what I'd like to ask first is just to, I've given you a bit of an introduction, but Lucy, would you just talk a bit about, because what I think is useful for people to know is how you got into the work. And I'd love you also to talk about why you use, what brought you to make, because you could be doing Shakespeare, you could be doing Sarah Kane, or but why are you making work that uses real people's words? So Lucy, would you start?
So I kind of I was brought up in a family that was quite political, and we would use storytelling as a way to sort of build community within where we lived. It was quite an active part of my upbringing, especially like international stories, and it was a way of sort of passing down information from sort of one generation to another. That felt quite important. So I sort of grew up with a love and an interest in stories, in listening to them and finding new ones. I used to love looking at old stories from, I don't know, things like Medea, and think, oh, how could I make this resonant and relevant now? But I also was very interested in political stories, and using theatre as a way of bringing people together to celebrate, but also, I guess, to interrogate community problems. and I trained as an actor, so I sort of went through quite a traditional training, but through that I was introduced to wicked companies like 784, which are a Scottish theatre company that make a lot of political documentary work. And I thought this was wicked, because I was going to the theatre and I was seeing shows, and I just didn't feel, that didn't really empower me. They felt quite far away from me, and I just felt a little bit distant from it, and I felt a little bit frustrated in that. And at the same time, I was living in South London, and a lot of change was happening in South London, and I thought theatre would be a great way of bringing people together to celebrate a community that was on the brink of change. And I started a company that wanted to specifically work with communities that were changing, so places like parts of Bristol and parts of South London and East London. So that's how I sort of started to make work. And that was specifically verbatim work. So it was all about meeting community members and understanding what needed to be, I guess, platformed and heard in a community that was being totally neglected and unlistened to, and sort of trying to find my sort of way through that as a facilitator more than anything. And Doug, what was your second question?
How did you come to using people's words rather than anything else? But I think you've answered that. What would you say is, you know, the power of it? Why use people's words? Why make verbatim theatre?
Well, I think especially at this time, we're dealing like in a world that has a lot of fake news, and you can't rely on journalism or the news or politicians anymore. And the kind of work that I'm interested in making is about the changes in communities. So a lot of it's to do with regeneration, or especially with women's stories of Ford Dagenham, the way that communities change when big parts of it, like with Ford Dagenham closing down in 2008, the sort of shift that the sort of negative and positive shifts in a community when something like that happens. So I guess what I wanted to do was find the authenticity in work and the spirit of the community in work, and serve a story totally honestly, and finding, I guess, the heart of what's happening in these communities. And I think that's the only way I think you can do that is to go to the people that are who are living through what's happening, and involve them as critical artists within your piece. So that's why I think it's important, because it creates authenticity and a real ownership over the work. And actually, as an artist, you've got to start to think of yourself, I guess, as a facilitator, because I think anyway, and I know that maybe other people have different processes, but if I involved my voice too much within that, well, I don't know anything about those communities in a way. I don't live there, and I haven't been through those experiences. So to create a real human understanding, I guess you've got to use those words, otherwise it just feels false, I think. So that's
would you just talk briefly about the Brixton project and the women's stories of Ford Dagenham, I suppose the heart of it was, and I mean, you've touched on it already, and why you wanted to tell that story?
Yeah, okay, so Women's Stories was a sort of intergenerational project between older women who were from Dagenham and Barking and Havering, and it was also for young women, so between 16 and 18-year-olds who were from the same area. And it was a her story project, so it was the passing down of female sacrifice and experience, and experience within the community from one woman to another. And that felt really powerful and important, because Women's Stories were specifically about the Ford Dagenham strikes and the sort of fight for equal pay, which happened in the late sort of 1980s, even though I guess we think it happened in the 1970s. It actually really came into sort of fruition in the 80s.
And I suppose I should I'll add is that it came about very much because we were doing Made in Dagenham. We were doing a new version of the musical Made in Dagenham, and I was really keen that there was a project that sat alongside it that had an authenticity to it.
Yeah.
And particularly gave a voice to those because obviously we think of For Dagenham as the 60s strikes,
yeah, right.
and as you said, they didn't achieve what they set out to do until the 1980s. So it felt really important to tell that story and let audiences also have a different perspective on that narrative. Great. Go on. Are you going to say something?
Well, I was going to say, I guess the heart of that piece totally changed when going through it, because we wanted to make it about lots of different women through the 70s and 80s, but actually what we started to really highlight on was the women in the 80s, because their stories have been totally forgotten about and aren't really heard in the film or in the musical. So the heart sort of shifted as we continued through the process, but it was about sort of building community, female spirit within the community, and also
that's interesting, isn't it? How you shifted artistically, the project became something different once you started to respond to the communities. Did you find that was similar in the Brixton project? Did it start as one thing and end up being something else?
No, I think that was a really it felt very urgent and immediate, because it was about about 4 estates that were getting demolished. So it felt like the heart of the piece was very much there from start to finish with a real clear purpose. I guess what did change was the idea of where it should be. So I wanted it to be in a theatre, but actually looking back on it now, I don't think it should have been in a theatre. I think it should have been on the streets.
That's interesting. Okay. Yeah, where does it happen? I think that's a really important point, isn't it? Which I would sort of go on to you, Dan, because that is something that sort of will come up with your project. Where does it happen? Will you tell us a little bit? I mean, obviously you work in verbatim. You're a playwright and you write, non-verbatim pieces as well. Because we did a reading of one of your plays, Legacy, which wasn't verbatim, but you're sort of at the heart of quite a lot of verbatim work because of working very closely with Aleki Blythe. And maybe you might just tell us a little bit about your relationship with Aleki. Jay, will you tell us a little bit, because Dan's from Romford, you just tell us a little bit about how you ended up being a theatre maker? And then it'd be great to hear about Jaywick and, why did you do it? What was important? What was important? And why people's words from that community?
Yeah. So I guess kind of way back, started out, I was like a little kiddie actor at Fair Kites across the road from Queen's Theatre, doing drama lessons on a Saturday. And through the Queen's Theatre, Panto and stuff like that was probably my first kind of experiences of kind of engaging with theatre. And then it wasn't though until after university that I kind of really kind of started pursuing writing properly. I always thought I wanted to be a film director, and then started a film degree and realised very quickly I did not want to be a film director. So started writing kind of in my spare time. And then off of that writing, while I was at uni, I did a couple of writers' courses at the Royal Court Theatre in London. And that's where I really kind of got into writing and theatre specifically. And then the verbatim side of things came about kind of a bit of things coming together. So I was working as an usher at the LAMDA Theatre in London. And my first show that I was working on there was a play called Little Revolution, which was a verbatim play by Aleki Blythe, which was all about the Hackney riots back in 2008, I think. That might be completely wrong. And
2011, I think it was.
Yeah, that sounds more right. Yeah, and I'd never kind of seen anything like it. And I'll get into detail a bit later about kind of the technique that I use and Aleki uses as well. But it was just kind of all the plays that I'd seen, I had never heard people talk like people talk in the real world, in such a way where people were talking over each other and didn't really make sense, and there were parts of it where you couldn't understand what someone was saying, but it kind of still made perfect sense because it was so real. And at the same time was a kind of, the government had released this kind of I can't remember what it's called now, but basically Jaywick had been announced, and it was all over the press, that it was the most deprived place in the whole of the UK, worked out on some kind of government indices of kind of like the facilities that they have there, and people unemployment and stuff like that. And it was all over the news. And I remember Jaywick as a kid. I used to go down to Clacton and Jaywick and had very fond memories of kind of walking along the Seawalk and stuff like that. So I was quite surprised. This place I honestly hadn't visited for about 20 years or so, but I kind of was interested with kind of my memories of the place, and then this terrible press that it was getting. So kind of that came at about the same time that I saw Little Revolution, and I was just like, okay, well, I'll go down to Jaywick then, and I'll see if I can make my own verbatim play, having no clue what I was doing whatsoever. And turning up kind of unannounced in Jaywick with a dictaphone and kind of asking people, can I interview you for a play? And being told unceremoniously to get lost quite a lot. But that was really the beginning of it. That ended up being kind of over 2 years in Jaywick, eventually recording with the residents there, and then making the play Carry On Jaywick, which kind of has had 3 iterations of it, or tours and showings, including in Clacton and in Essex. So yeah, that's kind of a little history of me.
And Lauren, will you talk about your project? And obviously Andrew is here as well. I mean, who was the musical, the composer of the music that was used. So, and I mean, it's interesting because it's obviously it has a different form, doesn't it? I mean, all 3 of the main projects have very different forms, but it being a musical is a really interesting form, when, you know, like London Road, when you're using real people's words. Will you tell us a little bit about tell us about that project and how you have come to, and obviously what the performance and who was in it as well, because that's strikingly different too.
Cool. So I was a teacher and youth theatre facilitator, in fact, Slammy youth theatre facilitator now, for years, and then did a lot of writing for the youth theatre, and kind of was using their voices a lot in my writing process and picking up on what they were concerned about and stuff, and directing their work. And then I had a significant birthday and a bit of a crisis, and decided I'd go to drama school to be a director, which I did. And while I was there, you had to, one of your projects was to devise a piece, and you had 3 actors and you could do whatever you liked. And whilst at drama school, I'd become kind of quite acutely aware of being working class. There were a lot of, like, I'd never met someone from Eton before in my life. There were loads of people from Eton there. It was a real shock. I was like, oh. So I decided to make my piece about West Ham fans. And it was at the time that they were moving from the Bowling to the Olympic Stadium in Stratford. So there's this big idea about identity and who we are and legacy and all of those really interesting questions. And so, having never done anything kind of really based on real people's lives before, I did a big call out and just sent out a questionnaire to anyone that was a West Ham fan, said, tell me about your lives, tell me about your experiences, tell them what they mean to you. And then with 3 actors, we created characters and devised this piece, and it was just a really beautiful experience, and just really loved it. And one of the characters in that piece had a wife who worked at the dog track in Romford, this character. So we decided to create a sister piece, but for this one, instead of doing questionnaires, we went out and did interviews with real people and just kind of met just this massive range of brilliant people who had this connection to the dog racing world in various different ways. And stepping the process up and doing interviews with those real people and beginning to use their words was really inspiring. So I did a few other projects using real people's words. Did a project with ladies in their 80s called As You Were. I did a project with women in about the first year of motherhood, because I'd had a baby and couldn't make any other work because I had her with me all the time, so I did that. and then kind of moved into kind of the participant-led work that I'm doing at the moment. So we did a piece last year about the suffragettes, and the ladies, it's and all, apart from Andrew, who's our MD, all of our participants are female,
including Emma, who's here.
And including Emma, who's here, yeah. All of our participants are female, and if there are any male characters, which we try not to have too many of, they're always played by women. And we did this piece on the suffragettes last year, and when I did my kind of evaluation afterwards, the things that the women really enjoyed were finding out about the stories of real women, and women that they'd never heard of, and stories that they'd never heard of. And they'd really enjoyed the singing as well. They'd found that was a real like community building piece. So moving forward for our next piece, I wanted to do something really tapped into what had empowered them and what had excited them about the piece. So I thought I'd do something historical, because they'd enjoyed that, but something that also either the participants themselves had personal memories of, they could contribute, or that people could look at their own family history and get stories from there. So from there we created Mummy, What Did You Do?, which is the project that we've had shared for this session. And so, yeah, people could either submit memories in writing. We had lots of really lovely letters that ladies in their 80s wrote to us, just reminiscing, just pages and pages and pages of things that they remembered from the war. We were lucky enough to have some participants that were in their 80s, so they could share their memories with us verbally. We invited some ladies to come in and chat to us, but we also had lots of our fantastic participants researched women in their own families and used their stories. And some of those were used verbatim, some of them were turned into, and then some of them were turned into scenes by writers in our community, and then the whole thing was put together by a dramaturg. So it's quite a long process. It's really interesting because it's so different from kind of the recorded delivery stuff that Dan does. It's kind of rooted, I think, in the same sort of spirit.
Great. Just a kind of couple of things there, just to flag up connections. I mean, this thing about class, about not meeting people from Eton, or like Dan, you said, hearing people talk on stage the way that they actually talk. I think class, it's interesting, all three of you, class comes into the work that you make quite significantly. I just want to ask, also this thing we keep using, real people. This phrase, real people, which says a lot about the theatre, doesn't it? What have you? This thing about real and what's real and what's not real. And our own individual definition of what is real, particularly around class. Lucy, who performed in the Brixton? So obviously in for Dagenham piece, we hear the voices of the women. Interestingly, you don't, and this is not for now, but we don't hear the voices of the younger women.
Young people, yeah, good point.
I wonder, maybe later on somebody might want to pick that up. But who performed in the Brixton piece?
We had 10 community performers. So some of them were sorry, I didn't explain very well what the Brixton piece was, but it was about a couple of estates that were getting demolished in Brixton, and so we wanted to celebrate the stories that had happened on those estates, and interrogate the local council who weren't doing anything about it, essentially, and weren't rehousing them. So a lot of them evictees, and then some of them were from Brixton and hadn't ever performed before, but wanted the chance to be part of a process and learn about how to make things.
Okay, so non-performers. But were any of the people you interviewed, did they perform in the piece?
No.
And Lauren, obviously, it's interesting, this thing about community doing the research as well, because obviously the young women did in Dagenham, the young women did a lot of the research. And then I'm interested also that your participants, Lauren, did quite a fair amount of the research as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of it, as I said, was quite personal research as well.
So I'm interested in this kind of impact of not only on the audience, but the people who are taking part. We can maybe talk about it a little bit later, but Dan, it seems yours were actors, weren't they? They were professional actors.
Yeah, so we had the play set up with 4 professional actors, and I think within an hour they played 48 different characters or something like that. So there were 4 actors playing every single person, from kind of switching from playing a 10-year-old girl to an 80-year-old man in like a split second. So yeah.
And it's interesting, Lauren, you said you have women playing men. I think there's an interesting question around what happens when you switch gender, because obviously I know there've been whole verbatim pieces where they've been about women's stories that have been performed by men, or the other way around, or adults performing the words of children, or likewise children performing, and that obviously adds a whole other layer to it. So there's a whole question about the people performing gives another narrative, doesn't it? It gives another lens, but we'll talk about that lens later on. I think here, I'd love to you just talk about, because if people were here suddenly go, I want to go off and make or anyone listening to it later on, I'm going to do what Dan did and just wander into a community with a dictaphone.
Don't do that.
And tell us about the brokering of the because Lucy, you spoke about trust earlier on before we started. How do you broker that relationship, and why is it important to broker a relationship with the community that you're working, the people that you're collecting the stories from? So Dan, do you want to go first?
So what I did, I turned up and kind of realized very quickly that people are not going to really want to speak to you. But what had happened that made it particularly tricky for me at the time was I arrived just after Channel 5 had released a documentary about Jaywick called Benefits by the Sea. And there was a lot of animosity around that, because when they were making the documentary, they had told the people involved in it that it was going to be called Jaywick Fights Back or something like that, and it was going to be a really positive documentary. So then what came out really wasn't, and so people felt very understandably like they'd been tricked and quite angry about what had happened, because off the back of all these documentaries and stuff like that, it meant house prices were going down, and it was really bad for the area. So what I did was I put my dictaphone away, and then I spent, I think it was a few months, getting to know people without recording anything. So I was doing trips down to Jaywick. At that point, I think it was probably every couple of weeks, I think. And just spending time getting to know people there. And what was really useful and good for me, and part of what's so special about Jaywick and what became a very big part of the play, was there are so many different community groups that I could go along to and get involved with, which means that, especially if you're kind of starting out, and what I think is the case for me, with where you don't really, you know that you want to tell a story in this world of Jaywick, but you don't know what the story is because you've not been there and it's not happened yet. So you kind of, at the beginning, cast your net as wide as possible, which can be very overwhelming. So meeting as many different groups of people and getting to know them, and them getting to know me, and building that trust, and a genuine trust of that I did genuinely want to do something different. I didn't want to kind of take advantage of them that they've been taken advantage of before. And I wanted to get to know them. And then it's a two-way street. I think that you have to give part of yourself to these people, because they're kind of offering up a lot of the times kind of their, not only their time, but their kind of stories and their histories. And the way that I record is, I don't do testimonials necessarily. It's more trying to capture stuff as it happens. So trying to be there and finding a story as it unfolds. So you need to build up a really, really massive trust with people. So that they're relaxed enough around you, so that they kind of will carry on as if the dictaphone's not there. Of course, they know they're being recorded at all times, but that they're that relaxed. And that also that they're kind of willing for you to go along to stuff and just be like, oh, well, you know that you said you were doing this thing on Sunday, can I come and just be the weird bloke with the dictaphone in the corner of the room while whatever's going on. So it's really about kind of taking the time to get to know people and being kind of as transparent as possible about what the project is. And I didn't know what the project was going to be at that stage. I didn't know what it was, but being quite honest about that, being kind of like, I have no idea what this is going to be, but I really want to kind of get to know you, and I feel like there is a story here to be told that hasn't been told.
And did they, were they theatre-going people, or I'm just thinking about when we as theatre makers rock up in communities that might not be necessarily theatre-going, how do we really explain what it is that we're hoping to do?
Yeah, I mean, like there was...
Particularly around Verbatim Theatre, you know, where that...
Yeah, and so there was kind of a mixture of kind of theatre going people. There was a group of people that went up to the I can't remember what it's called, the theatre in Clacton.
The Palette, no.
Is it Lee's? It's not Lee's Hall. I'm not sure.
It's not.
Anyway, but yeah, so they would kind of go to that, but there was no one kind of that I spoke to had a knowledge of what verbatim was, and that is tricky. And I think it is a thing of, no matter how much you are explaining what verbatim is to people, sometimes people are still going to take your word for it, because if it's that thing of you realise, and kind of we realised when the show went on very much, that people are like, oh yeah, I understand, I get it, but then they kind of see it and they're like, oh, I didn't realise that it was going to be that, or I didn't realise it was going to be that thing. So you do have to be careful. You just be as kind of open and explicit of being like, this is what this is, real people. And what I'd always say is, I'm making a play, I record everything, and the actors will be playing you in the play, and your words, what you have said, will be edited and used in the play. So you can be like explicit, but then when people come and see it, they're still kind of like, oh, that was actually me up there. That actor was playing me. I was like, yeah, I did say that was the idea, but it's a weird thing. So I guess it's hard to kind of get your head around it.
Lucy and Lauren, I might just, because I'm aware of the time, how you brokered that relationship. Lauren, will you go?
I think a lot of it, again, like Dan, it was that notion of continuing to explain, because the process was just so, particularly when I did my project with ladies in their 80s, that it was just so foreign to them that they just couldn't get their head around it. So continuing to explain it and being very reassuring. With the community work that I've been doing, I found one of the key things of brokering trust has been, I'm really lucky that I work with a community facilitator called Lee, who's just amazing and brilliant. And her role is solely there for the well-being of the participants, and solely there to look after the well-being of people who are sharing their stories and that kind of thing, so that there is always someone in the room or someone part of the process whose sole focus is to look after them and to ensure that they're being honoured and that their stories are being told truthfully, and that they're confident and happy that the way their words are being used.
And did they come into did they come into the rehearsal space? Where did that relationship start? Because obviously Dan's happened in the community. Did they come to you, or did you go to them?
For Mummy, or for...
Well, maybe for any of them. Did you go
so for As You Were, which was my project with ladies in their 80s, I did a call out. Do you live in Havering? Are you a woman? Are you over 80? We'd love to hear about your life. And we got a band of about 5 ladies that would come to the theatre every week, and sit in the cafe with me and a couple of the actors, and we'd just chat we'd record them, and we'd be really, really clear about that. But we'd just sit and chat over tea. And I think what worked well on that project was that the actors who were playing the women were the actors that had been interviewing them. So I didn't do all the interviews, unlike Dan. They sat and chatted, the actors sat and chatted. So that again built up a real trust, and it meant that when I was shaping the material, there was always again someone there that'd been like, no, that's not what Sylvia meant when she said that, or do you know what I mean? If you edit that bit out, it changes the meaning, and that was really, really helpful.
That's interesting about the people who give the stories, whether they, if they have editing rights. But we might come. I might actually, Lucy, I might move on, but you might be able to pick that up in questions, because I'm just aware that it's 20 to 8. Lucy, would you talk about editing? So as we're on that, how do you choose what to keep? How do you choose what to throw away? And also, and obviously that opens up the question around the ethics and what are the problems around, because who is the author?
Okay, so I think what was really important about women's stories was, just going off the back of brokering relationships, is once you've spent a considerable amount of time of just building a trust and a relationship, you start to understand the sort of the heart of the project, or at least I did, and I thought it was interesting before I went into interviews to have sort of a real clear sort of 8 to 10 questions that I could ask the women, so that by the time it got to editing, there wasn't thousands and thousands of words and hundreds of hours to go through, because whenever you use your dictaphone and you take a 3-hour, 2-hour meeting, it takes hours and hours to transcribe into a script. And so going into interviews and with some specific questions that can change and evolve as you go along the project was pretty fundamental in terms of then going into the editing process and being like, okay, I want to start by letting the audience care about the people that we care about now. So who are these people? Where do they live? What do they love to do? Why do they love their jobs at Ford Dagenham? And then you can kind of create a really great, I suppose, like relationship arc and sort of character arc through the project by then at the end going, okay, well, this is what's been lost and this is what's been gained. And actually from 1970 to 2016, how far have we come?
It's interesting you use the word arc, because obviously you are making the arc, aren't you, from all of that material? I mean, naturally we do, whereas I'm sure the way that they spoke wasn't linear in any way. There was no arc. No. Dan, would you talk about how you edited Jaywick? How you wrote a play, basically, didn't you?
Yeah, so with Carry On Jaywick, there was, and what I always kind of wanted to do was really tell a story that felt like a play, that had a beginning, middle and an end, and you were following a journey, which is tricky because of, especially at the beginning, where I didn't know what the journey would be or what the stories were, and I was just kind of had all these interviews, great interviews, and I was meeting people and spending lots of time there, but there wasn't a story. And then I met the lead character of the play, Danny, who, and this is the thing that you find when you're kind of doing Verbatim, is people kind of show themselves as kind of your main characters. Like the people, you need people that will talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, because that's all your material. You can't make anything up. So I met this character, Danny, and when I met him, he was planning to arrange a talent show in the town. So I was like, great. So I followed him from kind of him coming up with the idea to the talent show going on, and beyond that. And that was my journey. And then what that did really, which was really good for a narrative point of view, is we get to kind of tell all the stories of this town and kind of the issues that originally drew me there about its reputation and what's going on there and the different things, but in a way of that you're just at the side of it. You're watching this talent show, but through that talent show, you're seeing all of these stories that are within this town, which is really, really great. And then the other thing that the way that I do Verbatim is, which I learned from Aleki, is recorded delivery. So actors never ever get a script at all. There is a script, but they never see it. All of the way that they learn, well, they don't learn it. The way that they perform is with headphones. So they hear the edited interviews in their ears, even on stage when they're performing, and they repeat it as they hear it. So that way, and the reason for that is to try and do that thing of keep it as kind of, yes, there's editing in there, but keep it as close and true to the original intention as possible. So you have every cough and 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 hesitation and all of those things are in there, which not only does that thing of the dialogue feels very real, and that kind of like kind of really wonderful quality of stuff that you could never make up ever, because the way we talk is just nuts, and that's what's so brilliant. But it also kind of, it keeps as close as possible, because I don't think it is possible to kind of be 100% represent everything and represent everything exactly as it was, but as close as possible to kind of how it was originally said. Yeah, so, and then that's the editing is part of that, is always trying as much as possible. Yes, there's editing, and there'll be moments where I would take something that Danny said in August and then something Danny said in an interview later on, a year later, and I will edit those together, and when you see it, it seems like he said it in one thing. But what always matters, and what I think is really important, and where the difference comes of kind of when you go into grey area, is making sure that the intention of what that person is saying is always true. So maybe the way that it's coming across on the page isn't, because you need it to be kind of people to understand it and to tell a narrative, but it is still true to that person and their meaning behind it, even if it was 2 months apart or whatever.
Okay, so that becomes a touchstone for you. What I'm going to do is, because we're going to lose Dan at 8 o'clock, and we're going to go on until 15:15, but I'm going to unmute you all. I think I can do that. Are you unmuted? No. Oh, there you are. It's happening one by one. So questions. And will you, I think, probably direct your question at one person, just so that we get as many many questions out as possible. Anyone want to go first?
Oh, hi everyone. So Dan, so I'm basically born and bred in Hackney, Stoke Newington, and I just wanted to touch upon what you were saying about access in terms of basically like writing programs with the Royal Court and how one gets access to such programs.
Yeah, so with the Royal Court programme, what I did originally was their Young Writers programme, which was from 16 to 30, I think. And all you had to do was write 10 pages of a play and send it in. And I had never written a play before in my life when I did that, but I sent in this awful piece that made no sense, but it was about these 4 teenagers in Essex, in Romford, and I think that what people liked was that it was kind of a voice that they hadn't heard. And now I think that they've changed it and it's more open. So it's not called the Young Writers Programme anymore. I think that it's called the Royal Court Studio Group or Writers Group, and anyone can apply to that. I'm not sure what the terms are in regards to what you have to submit. I heard that now you have to submit a whole play, I think. I don't think it's just a short bit of it. But send it in. Everything that the Royal Court gets, they read fully and they give feedback to every play that they receive.
It's amazing.
I mean, at the moment, I don't know how that's all working, obviously, but generally that's what they do. And then on that, what it was once a week I went to the Royal Court, and it was in an evening, so it worked around work at the time, and it was with Leo Butler. So it's a kind of a Royal Court playwright is your teacher for that whole course, who was amazing, and he just kind of really went back to basics of kind of how to write a play and how to write the play. By the end of it, I had a play that I wanted to write, and then you write it and submit it. So I had no experience and didn't know what I was doing, but it was, I just kind of sent the work in and got on, and it was really, really supportive. And I think they were great. The Royal Court, because they accept anything and everything, is a really good place to start to send work to.
Perfect. No, thank you very much. Thank you.
Great. Are there any other questions?
Dan, you know the Jaywick play, I know Deborah Baker, who was in it, and obviously I watched it on the YouTube, and it's great, and it's like right up my street. What theatre company like was that with? Are they based in Essex, or was that just you producing it yourself and just going on with it? Because I'd love to like do something like that. I mean, you know, I work anyway, which is great, but just other contacts in Essex is exactly what I'm after, because I've been down here for like 8 years now. So who was that one with?
So originally it was myself, and like I was just kind of doing it myself. And then House Theatre, they are based in, I think it's Sussex, but they cover the southeast. Right. And what they do is they offer seed funding to plays that are, they did at the time, I'm not sure how it works now, but they offer seed funding for new work within the southeast. And so they funded me to make my trips. And I think that covered like the first year of me going down there. They paid for those trips. And then from that, we actually set up a theatre company. We set up a theatre company to do it, to make the play. But then we had the support from Doug at the Queen's when it came to doing the tour. Also, Barbara Pearson at the Lakeside Theatre Colchester at the University of Essex is amazing, and they gave us in-kind support. So when we did our first like R&D on the show, we did it at the theatre, and she supported that, and that was kind of a really good partner. So just reaching out really to kind of, we would kind of beg, stealing and borrowing from anyone in and around Essex and the southeast to kind of help us get it on.
Nice. And are you on Twitter yourself or not?
No, I'm not.
No, you're not.
I'm hide from social media.
Oh, that's all right. No, just to connect.
But ask Debs has my email, so get my email from Debs. Yeah.
Thanks, mate.
And you can always send Lauren a question as well, and we can pass it on.
Thanks. Thank you for that one.
Any other questions?
You know, you were saying how the actors don't get a script when they're casting your project. How do they kind of go about like building the characters and kind of getting to know them? Did they meet all the people that you interviewed, or how did it work, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, so it all comes from the voice. So all of the character stuff comes from the voice. And what's so amazing is, so Deborah, who Janine just mentioned, who played one of the characters she played was Brenda, and just from the voice, the audio that she listened to, whenever Deb played Brenda, she used to hunch over and do this thing with her hand, which is exactly what Brenda does. And she'd never met her, she'd never seen her, but she just got this from the voice. And it was similar with Graham, who played Danny, his mannerisms. He just got that from the voice. So yeah, they never met them until all of the people came to see it. And then I think actors were way more starstruck than real people were. But it's amazing, like trust, if you ever do it, trust the power of just the audio, that it really does all that character work's there. You don't, all that stuff that you kind of normally do in a rehearsal room is kind of gone because it's audio, all from the audio.
Just before, because we're going to lose you, Dan, I'd like to ask a question just to all three of you, is why this work in theatre, and when compared to, why not just watch a documentary? Why not just make a documentary or write an essay about it? Why theatre?
I think a big thing for me was that you don't really see these kind of characters on the stage. I think even still to now it's quite true, whereas I think there is more of that diversity in television. I also think that recorded delivery I love recorded delivery. I love that technique, and it's so for theatre it doesn't really work so well as a TV thing. I think if you watch a TV series and people had headphones in as they're performing, I think it would be quite jarring, whereas I think people suspend their disbelief at the theatre, and so it means that you can really play around with the form and play around with the dialogue and the way that you tell those stories.
I think for me it's about the care for the subject. So if there's nothing more alive, I think, than being at the theatre and understanding like what's happening in front of you. You can't get that from a piece of text. You can get that from film, but there's nothing like it in theatre, and about human experience and just getting to know and caring for those people on stage. I don't think you can get that in other sort of mediums. And so especially if there's an urgent political subject, caring for them and getting to know them, seeing them, I think is important.
That has it has a deeper impact, more a bigger emotional and therefore kind of political impact, rather than something that isn't a two-dimensional in a piece of paper. Lauren, why theatre?
I think for me that the using real people's words and that whole process is all about relationships, and I think that in terms of what medium you want to tell that story in, I think theatre is just the most obvious one, because you're building not only a relationship with the characters on stage and you're feeling that connection with them because you're sharing that moment with them in real time and in the same space, but you're also part of a collective and a community sitting there watching the piece as well. So it's the relationships between the performers who are telling these stories using real people's words and the audience that are watching them, but also the relationships that the audience create whilst watching it that I think are really important. And I think that collective experience is really key.
Particularly, a lot of yours about community, aren't you? So you're talking about a community in the same space with another community, even though that's in a performative. Are there any other questions?
Yeah.
There's, I think Richard, do you want to go?
Yeah, I do. I'm really fascinated by this verbatim theatre. I've seen Jaywick and loved it, and I've been involved with Lauren on her 2 last projects. But one of the things I've been thinking throughout is there's 2 things actually. There's one, social history. Have you ever thought about what all the work social historians have done and how they present that and how they represent communities? But also journalism. I think a lot of journalists would say, and I've certainly worked in this way in the past, that it's very, you're talking about making contact with the communities and you're sort of being trusted by them. And I think a good journalist does that in their writing. And although I absolutely agree that verbatim theatre makes it so alive and so immediate and so part of everything, I don't think you should underestimate what some good journalism can do for communities like Jaywick. It can really, not bad journalism like Channel 5. But I just thought I'd put those 2 things in because they're part of my background. And I just think it's really interesting to think about them.
Well, I think the interesting thing as well with journalism, it can obviously reach a much, much, much wider audience, can't it? Because obviously theatre is very limited to that. So I think people are talking about the deeper impact that theatre has, rather than negating journalism. It's what it has, you know, above a documentary or above a piece of journalism is the shared experience of a community sitting in a room together. So it's not one individual reading an article, it is a collective coming together, experiencing, which was all of yours, a collective. So I think it's not, I don't think they're negating journalism. I think we're just saying that.
No.
Is there any other questions? Yeah. Any other questions?
Yes, I had one for Lauren, actually, just in terms of what her process is in terms of when she basically goes to the community to ask questions. So would it be just speaking to somebody before you devising your questionnaires, or how does it work?
It's really varied depending on the project. So as I say, the early pieces were literally just me doing call outs on Facebook and using various like West Ham forums and then asking people to email me and sending out the questionnaires and then getting them back in. Or I think choosing the group of people or the community, in whichever sense of community you mean, whether it's a community in terms of a place or some sort of shared experience, I think once you know and you're really clear and specific about who that community is, and then reaching out to that community and kind of just building the relationships from there. I think the clearer you are about whose stories you want to tell with a specific project, the easier the process becomes and the easier it is for you to find, like Lucy was saying about how kind of the story emerges as you build those relationships and as you hold those interviews. And I've worked in lots of different ways, using the questionnaires, using interviews where we've just taken notes and used them as inspiration, or using, you know, a dictaphone and taking the words explicitly. Quite often I will work with a dramaturg or a playwright who will shape all the material we've got, so that there'll be a long kind of research and interview phase of the project where we're meeting lots of people, we're building those relationships, we're doing some kind of social and historical research alongside to give ourselves context for those stories that are being told. And then after that, once that period has come to an end, we will gather everything we've got, literally everything, and read, and it takes hours and hours and hours, and we will sit for a whole day and read everything, read all the interviews, read any scenes people have written, read letters people have sent us, and from that massive session then we'll shape the piece, and then it will continue to be shaped throughout the rehearsal process as well. For example, with Mummy, 2 of the ladies that were performing in it had written the monologues they were performing based on the experiences of their mothers or grandmothers. And then when they got the script, they were like, oh, there's a couple of little bits in there that really summed up or really spoke to me about my family member that haven't made it to the final script. Can I put them back in? And that was always absolutely fine as well. So it is I find it to be a much longer process than other types of work I've done, but one that's really challenging creatively as well.
I think that's the key, isn't it? The length of the process. Because Dan, you had a long process. Lucy, you spent a long time on. I mean, I don't know about the Brixton project, but Women's Stories of Ford Dagenham, which probably equally is a longer experience than documentary makers or even, you know, other forms. Are there any other questions?
Doug, I just need to go.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Thanks very much, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay.
See you later.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Lauren was talking about, which sounds like such a really fascinating and exciting process. Is any artistic license taken in terms of crafting the story, or is it just solely everything you get from the people, and that's where you work with?
Again, it depends on the project, and I'm always really, really clear with people about how we will be engaging with their material and how we'll be taking it forward. So a really good example actually of how artistic license has been taken, there's a scene in Mummy, What Did You Do?, where there are 3 women all engaged in domestic tasks, and they're talking about, they're having a conversation about their children and all their what decisions and what choices they've made about whether they keep their child with them during the war, whether they send their child away as an evacuee to live with people they don't know, or whether they've sent their child away to live with relatives. And that scene is fictional, and those 3 characters are fictional, but the choices they've made and the specifics that they are talking about have come from the words of women we've interviewed, or from the experiences of women in our company who'd interviewed their mums. So although the characters and the situation for that particular scene were fictional, there was a lot of artistic license taken. The 3 points of view that were being shared by those 3 women and the experiences that those 3 women were discussing were absolutely true. And I feel anyway, that the kind of the truth of their experience was very much conveyed, even though it was a scene that we had created.
Brilliant, thank you.
I think that sort of ties in with Dan's comment, doesn't it? When he took some text from an earlier interview to a later one, it was to do with the points of view and the intention of where you got the material from. I mean, also Lauren, but also interestingly, there's an artistic license, and maybe Andrew might want to join in this as well, because obviously London Road did this as well. But a very unusual form is that you turned it into song. And you used music, so there was a musical component to Mummy, wasn't there? And I'm just really interested in that. You know, you using that medium, which is obviously quite, you know, musicals are just, you know, are quite manipulative because there's a whole language in it which is about music, and music obviously accesses very different parts of our emotional experience. So. I mean, obviously, you know, the great example of it is London Road, but I wonder how you negotiated that, why you used that form, and how you negotiated using that within a performance which is essentially verbatim.
Shall I talk a bit about form, and then you can talk about the songs, Andrew? That's probably fair, isn't it? Yeah. So part of the reason that it was a musical was, as I said, it was a response to that particular community company who had really felt that the singing aspect of the work we'd done before was something that really empowered them, it really inspired them, they really enjoyed it. So we really wanted that to be a big part of the next project going forward. And again, that process I was talking about where we spend months gathering material and then have that big day of going through it all. Andrew was part of that process and sat with us on that day, and we worked out which stories or situations would best be served by song. Andrew's brilliant at kind of the form of a musical and where a song should come and what job a song should do, so we kind of left that to him, and then he went from there. Andrew, do you want to talk a bit?
So we knew we wanted to open the show with a song and close the show with a song, and then we wanted 2 other key moments that we thought could be enhanced by music within the show. So then it does feel like a musical because it's been properly bookended either end, and there's been kind of musical interludes. So I used a riff-based approach of doing a very short repeating musical fragment that kept kind of coming back, that was on the theme of war work, rather than a kind of big long song. So that kept a kind of music momentum going through without having to do lots and lots of songs, because it was only an hour-long piece and we wanted to get as many stories told. As for the style of music, it was quite a challenge of going, because this is set in the war, do we use music from that era, or is it more correct to use a contemporary style of music? And I decided that it was better to pastiche specifically the older styles with the Canary Girls song, so as then the true voice of the participants was delivered in a contemporary kind of musical theatre sound world.
Okay, and what was different, do you think, with the audience's experience if you hadn't have done it with music, and what was their experience with music? How would it have been different? I'm just wondering what it lent to the work. Obviously, it was very participant focused. Go on.
I think for me, focusing really on the bookended pieces, the bookending songs, the song at the beginning, just getting us into kind of not only the historical world of the play, but the emotional world of the play as well, and a really quick way of showing these are the stories of women. And there's a lovely lyric of Andrew's about the stories that haven't been told before, and being able to, and I thought song and music was a really clear way of conveying kind of the intention for the rest of the piece in a way that kind of a monologue or a scene would have been quite clunky and clumsy, but through song you were able to see the intention really beautifully. And then the piece at the end really brought together kind of the various voices we'd heard, and just I'm a bit of a sucker for lots of people on stage, and it's just a really beautiful moment. We'd never had all of the women on together, and to hear them singing as one for a piece that was about community and about women supporting each other, to hear and see those kind of 35 women on the foyer stage singing as one, again for me really captured the spirit of the project.
It was a way of uniting all the different narratives, of finding the connectivity and a sense of community, even though each story was a fragment. Yeah, that's great. I see. Great. I think any last questions?
Are you planning any more? Oh, sorry. Go on.
No, go on.
Are you planning any more verbatim pieces, or are either of you writing any at the moment? I don't know if you.
No.
No.
We've kind of, like everyone else, been a bit stalled. One of the stories that we uncovered as part of Mummy was a really, really strong story of female friendship, and that's going to be the basis of our next piece, a piece exploring female friendship and the idea of lifelong friendship and those sort of things. I think when Lucy was talking earlier about going to theatre and seeing lots of things that she kind of didn't really connect with, I'm really passionate about making work about friendship. I think that an awful lot of the narratives that we see and we're told are about romance, and they're about that very specific type of love and that very specific type of relationship, when in fact kind of like your lives are enriched by so many more types of relationship. And I think that the role of friendship and those kind of lifelong friendships is really underplayed in theatre, and that's what I'm going to be exploring next.
I'd love you, just because we're finishing off, to reflect back anything that it's always interesting to kind of key things that people have taken from this session. Is there anything?
I was going to say, verbatim material I think is really interesting in terms of the archive and in terms of stories out of history of who holds archives. Unless we produce those, particularly in Essex, unless we produce those archives, who else is going to do it and tell those narratives? And I think verbatim is a brilliant way to capture and hold an Essex voice, or showcase it. Particularly, I'm interested in the Essex voice particularly. And then also another thing that came up there about the length of time it takes to do this, and the funding structures often that we have to produce work, which are often very short. So traditional models are, you know, research period and then into production, a couple of weeks, do it. And actually these R&D processes take a lot longer, and the need to defend and articulate that length of time it takes to build community or work with different people. I sometimes also hate the term community because it's a very complicated term. So I always use the word people is a nice way around community sometimes, because it stops it being about the community of Romford, does it?
And what is that?
The peoples of a particular place.
So I think it's interesting about that. I think, you know, obviously it's a documentary, so it's a different, so with Dagenham, I mean, a lot of the funding, the application for that, for the HLF funding for that was about legacy and archive. But it's interesting about theatre, but I'm not sure we necessarily talk about theatre pieces in the same way in funding, and maybe that's, I think you're absolutely right. I think that kind of archive.
Sorry, can I just
go.
I think we haven't really spoken a lot about legacy, and I think it feeds a lot into why you make the piece and why you specifically, because I know we've spoken a lot about people, us just entering communities that we aren't, and sometimes that can be quite tricky, because, you know, why should you be telling this story? And I think that's a really good question to ask. And your role within that, you know, why do you want to make this piece, and why is it specifically for theatre? Because also some verbatim you find doesn't have a lot of dramatic like push or force throughout a story. So I guess it's about how do you create something that is authentic and for theatre, and how do you continue those relationships after the show or after the project? How do you not make it about you and your career and theatre? How do you make it about the people, and how do you keep the relationship going after? I think it's really tricky, and I think it's a really hard balance to strike, because obviously, especially with funding, you are funded for a particular amount of time, and you know, especially by an organisation, and then the funding stops. How do you keep a relationship active or going? How do you not just use the material for the sake of theatre? How do you keep it alive, and how do you keep it honest? Is I think a big thing I've learned along the way.
So any other reflections back?
I just wanted to say it's quite inspiring to hear you all whilst we're all indoors, sometimes feeling a little bit demotivated. So yeah, it's just good to hear everyone's ideas. Basically, that's my 2 penneth.
Great. Anything else?
I really enjoyed it.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Janine. Well, thank you. I mean, on that note, there are more. So Lauren's going to send you an email tonight, actually, what the next one is. Because quite often Outer Limits gets very focused on, you know, the directing, writing, us in, you know, like Janine, you were sort of talking about earlier on about companies that everyone making a company to make work. So I was really, and quite often we don't talk about the acting career in its, you know, in its raw form, and how you sustain a career. So we have obviously we've got a really wonderful friend at the Queen's Theatre who's performed there, and she has a kind of extraordinary story about, you know, her background and how she got into theatre, and how she, you know, doesn't have training, and how she sustained a career. So Lucy Benjamin is going to come and talk to us about warts and all, and she's really up warts and all to talk about how hard it is and the energy that it takes, and the difference between television and film, and offer advice and answer any questions there. So you'll get that email will give you all the times. It will go back to Tuesday next week. So great, thank you all for coming. Thank you. It's lots of really great food for thought around that work. Really, really great. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you for organising. Yeah. Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Thank you very
thanks
much.
everyone. Thanks for your time.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.